Operation Haudegen, the last Germans to surrender. When discussing the end of World War II in Europe, the date is seared into historical memory, the 8th of May 1945. VE Day, the fall of Berlin, the signature at Reims. It is the definitive full stop on 6 years of conflict. But a full stop implies totality. It implies that when the instruments were signed, every gun everywhere fell silent. That is not what happened. There were pockets of German resistance that held out for days, even weeks, driven by fanaticism or simple lack of communication. But one group of German soldiers not only missed the surrender by days, they missed it by months. They finally surrendered in September of 1945, 4 months after the war in Europe had ended. And they did so not to a general or a high-ranking officer, but to the captain of a Norwegian seal hunting vessel. This wasn't a holdout of desperate SS men in a Bavarian redoubt. This was a team of 11 meteorologists and geographers stationed in the high Arctic. Their story isn't one of last-ditch fanaticism, but of administrative failure, extreme survival, and the strange, quiet end of a war that simply forgot about them. To understand how a war ends for men like this, you have to understand that for them, the war didn't end with a signature. It ended when the outside world finally remembered to come and get them. To understand Operation Haudegen, you have to forget the tanks and the infantry divisions for a moment and look up at the sky. In the European theatre, weather was a weapon. The success of the Normandy landings hinged on a narrow window of acceptable conditions. The Battle of the Bulge was made possible by a thick blanket of fog that grounded the Allied air forces. Knowing what the weather was going to do 24 or 48 hours in advance was arguably as valuable as knowing the enemy's troop movements. And the weather that battered Europe originated in the North Atlantic and the Arctic. The British had been running weather stations in places like Svalbard, a rugged archipelago far north of Norway, for years. The Germans, reliant on their navy and air force, needed that data just as badly, but they couldn't exactly set up a station in downtown Longyearbyen. So they got creative. Throughout the war, they launched clandestine operations, codenames like Knosp and Nussbaum, inserting small teams by ship and aircraft to remote Arctic coasts to transmit data back to the Wehrmacht. By the autumn of 1944, Germany was retreating on all fronts. The war was lost strategically, but tactically the need for weather data didn't diminish. The Kriegsmarine still needed to know if the fjords in Norway were freezing. The Luftwaffe needed to know if there was a break in the clouds over the North Sea. This brings us to Unternehmen Haudegen, Operation Broadsword. In September 1944, the submarine U-307 and a supply ship, the Carl J. Busch, pushed through the ice of the Reipfjorden on the northeastern coast of Nordaustlandet. This wasn't the relatively inhabited west coast of Spitsbergen, this was true high Arctic desert. Their mission was to establish a weather station codenamed Haudegen, led by a geographer named Dr. Wilhelm Deege. Deege was not a stereotypical stormtrooper. He was a scientist who had led expeditions to Svalbard before the war. His second-in-command was a man who had trained in the giant mountains, learning to build snow huts and survive in extreme cold, not to clear trenches. The 11 men who came ashore were equipped with skis dog sleds and enough supplies to last the winter. They built 2 wooden huts, camouflaged them, and began sending coded weather reports back to the station in Tromsø, Norway. They lived through the polar night, 126 days of darkness with temperatures dropping far below zero, the ever-present threat of polar bears, and the suffocating isolation of an Arctic winter. For them, the war was an abstraction. They could hear faint whispers of it on the radio. But their reality was the wind, the ice, and the daily ritual of releasing weather balloons into the frozen sky. They were soldiers, yes, but they were functioning as technicians. They had no intention of fighting. Their job was to observe and transmit. In early May 1945, they received an order from the Luftwaffe. They were to prepare an airstrip. A plane was coming to pick them up. The men scraped together a makeshift landing strip in the snow and waited, but no engines were ever heard. Instead, on May 8th, a message crackled through from their command in Tromsø. The fatherland has capitulated, the war is over. And then radio silence, Tromsø went dead. The men of Operation Haudegen were now, technically, an anachronism. They were still armed, still in uniform, still operating an enemy weather station on sovereign Norwegian territory. But they were also 11 men sitting in a hut at the top of the world with no way home. Think about their position. They had no ships. They had a small rowboat, useless for a journey of hundreds of miles through ice-choked seas. They had enough supplies to survive, but not indefinitely. They were stranded. They continued to send out their weather data on the open frequencies, hoping someone would hear them. They even tried signaling on Allied distress channels, essentially begging the people they had been fighting against to please come and take them prisoner. This period is perhaps the most human of the entire operation. The war was over. The world was celebrating, rebuilding, processing the horror of the concentration camps. And these 11 men, isolated from that world, were simply waiting to be remembered. They played table tennis until the ball fell apart. Deege, ever the scientist, continued his geological research, mapping the area and studying the geology, because what else was he supposed to do? Finally, in late August, they got a response. The Norwegian government, alerted to their presence, chartered a seal hunter, the Blasel, to go and collect them. On the 3rd or 4th of September 1945, the ship arrived in the fjord. The moment is almost absurd in its quiet dignity. Dr. Deege went aboard to formally surrender to the captain, a man named Albertsen. Deege, in his German uniform, approached the Norwegian skipper and formally surrendered his weapon. The captain, a hunter, but not a naval officer, reportedly didn't know what to do. He had no paperwork for this. Deege reportedly said, "I don't know how to handle this either," but it was done. The last organized German unit of the Second World War had formally capitulated, 4 months after the Reich collapsed. When they arrived back in Tromsø, they were finally taken into captivity. But the story has one more layer. For Deege and his men, the war ended in 1945, but the consequences of that war, the division of Germany, haunted them for decades. For years after, they tried to hold reunions. But some lived in the West, some in the East. The Cold War made it almost impossible for them to meet, a final, lingering consequence of a war they had stopped fighting long ago. Why does Operation Haudegen matter? It matters because it strips away the grand narrative and leaves us with the raw edges of history. It shows us that war doesn't end on a schedule. It ends in fits and starts. For these men, the transition from soldier to prisoner to civilian was a confused, lonely, and drawn-out process. They were not heroes, nor were they villains in the dramatic sense. They were men left behind because the bureaucracy of war forgot about a hut in the ice. Their story is a lesson in logistical reality. It's a testament to the fact that strategy isn't just about winning battles, it's about accounting for your people when the battle is done. And it's a powerful reminder that in the vast, indifferent spaces of the Arctic, human conflict can feel absurdly small. The survival skills they learned, the discipline to maintain their post for months after the war ended, and the quiet way they handed over their rifles to a confused seal hunter, that is the real unglamorous and deeply human face of surrender. If you value deep dives into the overlooked corners of military history, the kind that focus on the conditions, the decisions and the consequences rather than the usual headline battles, make sure you subscribe to War Machina. Hit that like button if you think we need to remember the stories that history almost forgot.